On New Year's Eve, Tristan Robert, a lonely billionaire CEO, sat alone in his sprawling penthouse perched high above the city. A glass of untouched scotch rested in his hand. The room was the epitome of modern luxury, gleaming marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering city lights, and art pieces worth more than most people's homes. Yet, despite the grandeur, the silence was heavy, suffocating. It was New Year's Eve, a time for celebration, but Tristan had turned down every invitation to galas, private parties, and exclusive gatherings. His assistant had been exasperated. "You need to be seen," she had insisted, half pleading, half chiding. Tristan had merely shaken his head and muttered something about being too busy. The truth was far simpler. He didn't want to go. There was no one he truly wanted to be with. The world envied him, a self-made billionaire by 35, the architect of a thriving tech empire, living a life most people could only dream of. Yet, as laughter and celebration echoed faintly from the streets below, Tristan felt nothing but an aching hollowness. He glanced at the sleek clock on the wall. It was 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes until midnight, another year, and another cycle of empty triumphs. His phone buzzed on the glass table beside him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Only a handful of people had this number, and none ever called with good news. But the persistent vibration cut through the stillness, compelling him to answer. "Robert," he said curtly, his voice heavy with weariness. "Mr. Roberts?" The voice on the other end was female, calm yet urgent. "This is Nurse Thompson from St. Mark Hospital. I'm sorry to disturb you, but this is an urgent matter." Tristan sat up straighter, confusion clouding his thoughts. "I think you have the wrong number," he replied. "No, sir," the nurse responded quickly. "We have a newborn here, and the mother listed you as the father. She passed away during childbirth." The words hit him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his tone sharp, almost angry. "I don't have a child. There must be some mistake." "I understand this is shocking, sir," the nurse said, her tone steady but laced with sympathy. "The mother named you in her final moments. We need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." Tristan's mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. "What's the mother's name?" he asked, his voice tight. "Susan Walter," the nurse said after a brief pause. The name landed like a stone in the pit of his stomach. Susan. He hadn't thought about her in years. They had dated briefly, just a few months, but it had ended amicably, or so he thought. She'd been kind, creative, and unlike anyone else he'd ever met in his cutthroat world. He had admired her warmth but had been too consumed by his ambitions to truly let her in. This can't be right," he said, his voice thick with denial. "Susan and I haven't spoken in years. If this were true, she would have told me." "She didn't have much time," the nurse interrupted gently. "But she made it clear that you're the father, sir. The baby needs you." Tristan sank back into his chair, the room tilting around him. A baby. His baby. The words felt surreal, impossible. How could he, of all people, be a father? He had spent his life avoiding entanglements, building walls no one could climb. Now, out of nowhere, he was being told he had a child. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he muttered, almost to himself. "I understand this is difficult to process," the nurse said patiently. "But the child needs immediate care and a legal guardian. Please come to the hospital and bring identification. We'll explain everything when you arrive." Tristan's grip tightened on the phone. His first instinct was to refuse, to dismiss this as a misunderstanding and return to his carefully constructed life. But something in the nurse's tone, the urgency, the quiet plea, stopped him. He thought of Susan, her kind smile, and the way she had looked at him as though she saw something deeper than the ruthless facade he showed the world. Could she really have been telling the truth? Carrying his child all this time without telling him? "Fine," he said, the word heavy with reluctance. "I'll be there." The nurse thanked him and hung up. Tristan sat motionless for a moment, the silence of the room now oppressive. He set the phone down and rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the chaos suddenly thrust into his orderly existence. Rising from the chair, he walked to the massive windows overlooking the city. Fireworks had begun to burst in the distance, their vibrant colors painting the night sky. He watched them in silence, their celebratory energy a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. After a moment, he turned away and grabbed his coat. His sleek black car waited in the private garage below, but for once, he didn't feel the usual satisfaction of the effortless luxury it represented. As he drove through the city, the streets alive with revelers, he felt a strange pull of fate, as if the universe had chosen this night to upend everything he thought he knew. When he pulled into the hospital parking lot, the weight of the situation fully settled on his shoulders. He didn't know what awaited him inside: an infant, a piece of himself he never knew existed, and a reality he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But for the first time in years, Tristan Robert felt something other than emptiness. It was fear, yes, but also the faintest spark of something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. Tristan stepped into the dimly lit hospital corridor, the sterile smell of disinfectants stinging his senses. The quiet hum of machines and muffled voices echoed faintly, a stark contrast to the celebratory chaos he had just driven through. Fireworks had lit up the night sky as he made his way across the city, each explosion of color only deepening his sense of unease. Now, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, he felt the weight of reality pressing down on him. A nurse approached him, her expression professional but tinged with sympathy. "Mr. Robert," she asked softly. Tristan nodded, his throat dry. He had spent the drive convincing himself this was a mistake, that somehow this was a mix-up. But the look in her eyes told him otherwise. "Follow me," she said, her voice calm but firm. She led him through a maze of hallways until they reached a small, quiet office. She gestured for him to sit, then handed him a sealed envelope.
"This is from Susan," she said.
"She asked that you receive it if something happened to her." Tristan stared at the envelope, his name written in Susan's familiar handwriting. For a moment, he couldn't move. His hands, so steady in boardrooms and negotiations, now trembled as he reached out to take it. The nurse gave him a moment of privacy, slipping out of the room with a promise to return shortly. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his breath catching as he recognized her words. So uniquely Susan, thoughtful, heartfelt, and unflinchingly honest. "Dear Tristan, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here." Writing those words feels surreal, but I knew I had to prepare for the possibility. There's so much I want to say, but I'll try to keep it simple. First, I want you to know that I didn't keep our child from you out of spite or secrecy. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you. I saw the weight you carried, the empire you were building, the walls you surrounded yourself with. And I thought giving you this news might only make it harder for you. But as I carried our daughter, I realized how wrong I was. I thought about you every day, Tristan. I thought about how kind you could be when you let your guard down, how much passion you poured into what you cared about, and how I saw glimpses of a man who could love deeply, even if he didn't realize it himself. Her name is Ella. I chose it because it means play in some languages, and I want her to have a life full of joy and laughter. But she also needs stability, love, and someone to guide her. That's why I named you. Because no matter how much I doubted myself, I never doubted you. Please take care of her, Tristan. She's part of you, part of us, and I believe she'll be the best thing that ever happens to you. With love, always. Susan. Tristan lowered the letter, his chest tight. He hadn't cried in years, decades, maybe, but now his vision blurred, and he had to steady himself against the table. Her words echoed in his mind, each one pulling him deeper into a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. The nurse returned, her presence grounding him. "Are you ready to meet her?" she asked gently. He hesitated but nodded. His legs felt like lead as he followed her down another hallway, every step bringing him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he could handle. When they reached the neonatal unit, the nurse stopped in front of a large window. Inside, rows of tiny cribs lined the room, each holding a fragile new life. She pointed to one near the corner.
"That's her," she said.
Tristan stepped closer, his breath catching. There she was, a tiny bundle swaddled in pink, her features delicate and impossibly small. Her dark hair curled softly against her forehead, and her face held an expression of peaceful oblivion. His instinct was to step back, to retreat to the safety of denial. This couldn't be real. How could something so small and vulnerable possibly belong to him? But as he stood there, he felt an inexplicable pull, a magnetic connection that rooted him to the spot. The nurse must have sensed his hesitation.
"You can hold her if you'd like," she said.
His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. "I don't know how." "That's okay," she said with a reassuring smile. "I'll show you." Moments later, Tristan was sitting in a rocking chair, the nurse gently placing Ella in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, yet he felt as though the universe itself had shifted in that moment. Her tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, her fingers curling reflexively. He reached out hesitantly, and when her hand closed around his finger, something inside him broke open. Tristan sat motionless, the phone still in his hand, the nurse's words echoing in his mind. His chest felt heavy, his breath shallow. A secret this immense, carried for so long. How could she not have told him? "Fine," he had said at last, the word weighted with reluctance. "I'll be there." He set the phone down, rubbing his temples, as if that could bring clarity to the storm of emotions crashing over him. Rising, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. The city stretched out below, vibrant and alive. Fireworks burst in the distance, their brilliant colors painting the night sky. He watched in silence, the celebratory display a sharp contrast to the turmoil within him. After a moment, he turned away, grabbed his coat, and headed to his car. The sleek black machine waited in the private garage, but for once, its effortless luxury brought him no satisfaction. Driving through the city, the streets buzzing with revelers, he felt an inexplicable pull, as though the universe had chosen this night to rewrite his story. When he pulled into the hospital parking lot, reality bore down on him. Inside awaited something he had never imagined: a child, a part of himself he didn't know existed, and a life he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Yet, for the first time in years, Tristan felt more than emptiness. There was fear, yes, but also the faintest glimmer of something else.
Hope.
The hospital corridor was dimly lit, the sterile smell of disinfectants sharp in the air. The quiet hum of machines and muffled voices created an oppressive stillness. The contrast between this solemn atmosphere and the fireworks he'd driven through was jarring. "Mr. Roberts?" A nurse approached him, her tone soft but professional. He nodded, his throat dry. "Follow me," she said gently. Her voice was calm but firm as she led him through a maze of hallways to a small, quiet office. She gestured for him to sit, handing him a sealed envelope. "This is from Susan," she explained, her voice faltering for a moment. "She asked that you receive it if something happened to her." Tristan's hands trembled as he took the envelope, his name written in Susan's familiar handwriting. The nurse stepped out to give him privacy, leaving him alone with the letter. He stared at it for a long moment, unable to move. Finally, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The words were unmistakably hers, thoughtful, heartfelt, and unflinchingly honest. "Dear Tristan, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here. Writing these words feels surreal, but I knew I had to prepare for the possibility. There's so much I want to say, but I'll try to keep it simple. First, I want you to know that I didn't keep our child from you out of spite or secrecy. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you. I saw the weight you carried, the empire you were building, the walls you surrounded yourself with, and I thought this news might only make it harder for you. But as I carried our daughter, I realized how wrong I was. I thought about you every day, Tristan. I thought about your kindness when you let your guard down, the passion you poured into what you cared about, and the glimpses of a man who could love deeply, even if he didn't realize it himself. Her name is Lila. I chose it because it means play in some languages, and I want her life to be full of joy and laughter. But she also needs stability, love, and someone to guide her. That's why I named you. Because no matter how much I doubted myself, I never doubted you. Please take care of her, Tristan. She's part of you, part of us, and I believe she'll be the best thing that ever happens to you. With love, always. Susan. Tristan lowered the letter, his chest tight. He couldn't remember the last time he cried. Decades, perhaps, but now his vision blurred, and he had to steady himself against the table. A soft knock broke the silence. The nurse stepped back in, her expression kind. Are you ready to meet her? She asked gently. He hesitated, but then nodded. His legs felt like lead as he followed her down another hallway. When they reached the neonatal unit, the nurse stopped in front of a large window. Inside, rows of tiny cribs lined the room. She pointed to one in the corner. That's her, she said softly. Tristan stepped closer, his breath catching. There she was, a tiny bundle swaddled in pink. Her delicate features and dark curls seemed impossibly small, her peaceful expression untouched by the world's chaos. His instinct was to retreat, to deny this reality. But he felt a pull he couldn't explain, an invisible connection rooting him to the spot. You can hold her if you'd like, the nurse offered. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. I don't know how. That's okay, she said with a reassuring smile. I'll show you. Moments later, Tristan sat in a rocking chair, Lila placed gently in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, yet he felt as if the universe itself had shifted. Her tiny hand peeked out from the blanket, her fingers curling instinctively. When her hand closed around his finger, something inside him broke open. She's perfect, he whispered, the words spilling out unbidden. The nurse smiled. She's been waiting for you. As he rocked her gently, Tristan's thoughts returned to Susan's letter. Her unwavering belief in him. He wasn't ready for this. How could he be? His life was a fortress of ambition and control. Yet here she was, demanding nothing but the love he wasn't sure he knew how to give. He looked down at her tiny, innocent face and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know. Lila stirred slightly, letting out a tiny yawn. It brought an unexpected smile to his face. The nurse returned quietly, holding a birth certificate form. Would you like to fill this out? She asked. Tristan stared at the blank space where her name should go. Finally, he wrote, Lila's Susan Robert. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the hospital windows as he held her close. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond fear and guilt, a flicker of warmth, of hope. And he knew, in his heart, that he couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not now. Lila's tiny face scrunched for a moment before relaxing, her mouth forming a perfect little O. Tristan couldn't help but smile, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction. Lila, he murmured, testing the name aloud. It felt right, just as Susan had said, playful, light, a promise of joy. But it needed something more, a connection to the woman who had brought her into the world and entrusted her to him. Lila's Susan Robert, he said softly, the words carrying more weight than he expected. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, holding her closer. That's your name, Lila's Susan. The act of naming her felt transformative. It was a declaration, a commitment, a recognition that she wasn't just a baby in his arms. She was his daughter. She was his responsibility now, and no amount of fear or self-doubt could change that. For the first time, Tristan allowed himself to truly see her. He took in every detail, her tiny hands, the wisps of dark hair curling against her forehead, the delicate curve of her cheek. She was so small, so utterly dependent on him, yet something about her presence felt powerful. She didn't care about his wealth or achievements. All she needed was someone to hold her, to keep her safe. I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job, he admitted quietly, his voice trembling. But I'll try. I promise I'll try. Lila stirred again, her tiny hand breaking free of the blanket. Her fingers curled and uncurled, and Tristan hesitantly reached out. When her fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't a dramatic transformation or a sudden epiphany, but a quiet, steady realization. She was his. And for the first time in his life, that terrified him more than anything else. He sat there for a while longer, rocking her gently as the morning light filled the room. His thoughts drifted to Susan and the brief months they had spent together. She had been so different from anyone else he had dated, kind, grounded, unafraid to challenge him. He had ended things because he hadn't seen a place for her in his world. Now he wondered if that had been his greatest mistake. The door opened again, admitting a nurse with a clipboard. She smiled warmly as she took in the scene. "How's she doing?" she asked softly. "She's perfect," Tristan replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The nurse nodded. "That's what we like to hear. I just need to go over a few things with you. Paperwork, discharge procedures, things like that. Do you have someone you'd like to call? A partner or a family member who can help?" The question caught him off guard. His mind immediately went to his assistant, his colleagues, the network of people who managed every aspect of his life. But none of them were family. None of them were Susan. "No," he said after a moment. "It's just me." The nurse didn't press him, instead guiding him through the process with practiced efficiency. Tristan listened, his mind only half absorbing the details. He kept one hand on Lila's blanket the entire time, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. By the time they finished, the weight of the situation had fully settled on his shoulders. He had named her, held her, and promised her a life he wasn't sure he could provide. But there was no going back now. This was his reality, and for better or worse, he was determined to face it. As the nurse left, Tristan looked down at Lila once more. She had fallen asleep again, her tiny face peaceful and serene. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'll figure it out. For you, I'll figure it out." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, a gesture awkward and unfamiliar, but full of meaning. The flicker of connection he had felt earlier was growing stronger now, filling the empty spaces within him. Lila's Susan Robert wasn't just his daughter. She was his chance to be something more, to build a life that mattered. Tristan was there for the feedings, the sleepless nights, and the quiet moments when Lila would gaze up at him with wide, curious eyes. But even as he adjusted to his new life, doubts lingered. One evening, after finally getting Lila to sleep, he sank onto the couch, letting his head fall into his hands. The weight of it all pressed down on him, an endless tide of questions and fears. Was he doing enough? Was he good enough? He thought of Susan's letter and her unwavering belief in his capacity to love and care for their daughter. She had seen something in him that he struggled to see in himself. But what if she had been wrong? What if he let Lila down the way his father had let him down? The sound of tiny coos pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Lila in her crib, stirring in her sleep, but not yet waking. Her face was peaceful, her little fingers curling around the edge of her blanket. She was so small, so innocent, and yet she had already changed his world in ways he couldn't have imagined. Tristan stood and walked over to her crib, gazing down at her. He thought about his father again, the long stretches of silence, and the heavy weight of expectations that had defined his childhood. He thought about the boy he had been, yearning for a kind word or a moment of connection that never came. "I won't do that to you," he whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. You deserve better." He reached down and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The promise felt heavy, but it also felt right. Lila deserved more than he had been given, and for her, he was willing to try. The weeks turned into a blur of firsts, first smiles, first attempts at holding her head up, first moments where Tristan felt the faintest glimmers of confidence. Each milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But there were setbacks too, nights when nothing seemed to calm her, days when he felt the crushing weight of his own inadequacies. Still, he pressed on. He started reading parenting books in the late hours of the night, seeking advice and guidance wherever he could find it. He reached out to an old friend, a father of 3, and listened as he recounted his own struggles and triumphs. Bit by bit, Tristan began to believe that he could do this. that he could be the father Lila needed. One afternoon, while Lila napped in her crib, Tristan stood in the living room and stared at a stack of files on the table.
Work.
It had been weeks since he had stepped into his office, delegating everything to his team while he focused on Lila. The thought of returning to that world felt distant, almost foreign. For years, his work had defined him, filling the empty spaces inside him with purpose and accomplishment. But now, as he looked at the files, he realized something had shifted. Lila had filled those spaces in a way that no achievement ever could. He turned away from the files and walked back to the nursery, sitting beside her crib. He watched her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She was his world now, his reason for trying, his reason for believing he could be better. For the first time, the weight of responsibility didn't feel so heavy. It felt like love. The days began to take on a rhythm, an imperfect but comforting cadence. As Tristan settled into his new role as a father, there were moments of chaos, of course. Nights when Lila refused to sleep, mornings when he couldn't seem to get her to stop crying. But there were also moments of quiet triumph. He was learning, slowly but surely, how to care for her. He started to recognize the little cues that signaled her needs, the hungry cry, the sleepy whimper, the way her tiny fists curled when she was frustrated. And with every successful feeding, every calm moment after a fit of tears, he felt a small spark of pride. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One morning, as the soft light of dawn filtered through the nursery window, Tristan sat with Lila in his lap. She was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. Her tiny mouth formed an almost smile. Suddenly, she let out a soft gurgle, her face lighting up with something that could only be described as joy. It was her first real smile, and Tristan froze, unsure if he'd imagined it. But then she did it again, her lips curling in a way that made his chest ache. "You're smiling," he whispered, a grin spreading across his own face. "You're actually smiling." He felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, a mixture of joy and disbelief. She was still so small, so new to the world, yet in that tiny smile, Tristan saw the beginnings of a bond he hadn't been sure he could form. He leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart swelling in a way he hadn't thought possible. Moments like these made the sleepless nights and constant self-doubt worth it. They gave him the strength to keep going, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But as he grew closer to Lila, Tristan couldn't ignore the growing divide between his new life and the one he had built before her. His company had been his entire world for years, a relentless pursuit of success that left little room for anything else. But now, as he watched Lila's tiny milestones, her first laugh, her fascination with the colorful mobile above her crib, he found himself questioning everything. What was the point of all his accomplishments if he couldn't be present for these moments? If he missed the chance to watch his daughter grow? It wasn't an easy decision, but Tristan began to step back from his role as CEO. He delegated responsibilities to his most trusted colleagues, ensuring the company would continue to thrive in his absence. There were objections, of course, investors who questioned his priorities, board members who doubted his commitment. But Tristan stood firm. For the first time in his life, work came second. Instead of 12-hour days in the office, he spent his mornings with Lila, reading to her, feeding her. Tristan's days were divided between his new responsibilities and his old ones. He embraced the sleepless nights, the feedings, and the quiet moments when Lila looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. Yet, despite the progress, doubts still lingered. One evening, after finally getting Lila to sleep, he sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of it all pressed down on him. He questioned whether he was doing enough, if he was good enough. His thoughts turned to Susan's letter, her unwavering belief in his capacity to love and care for their daughter. She had seen something in him he struggled to recognize. But what if she was wrong? What if he let Lila down the way his father had let him down? The soft sound of tiny coos broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Lila stirring in her crib, not yet awake. Her face was peaceful, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of her blanket. She was so small, so innocent, and yet, She had already changed his world in ways he couldn't have imagined. He stood, walked over to the crib, and gazed down at her. He thought of his father again, of the silence, the expectations that had defined his childhood. He remembered the boy he once was, yearning for a kind word or connection that never came. "I won't do that to you," he whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. You deserve better." He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The promise felt heavy, but it also felt right. Lila deserved more than he had been given, and for her, he was willing to try. The weeks blurred into a haze of firsts. First smiles. First attempts to hold her head up. First moments when Tristan felt a glimmer of confidence. Each milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But there were setbacks too. Nights when nothing seemed to calm her. Days when he felt the crushing weight of his own inadequacies. Still, he pressed on. He read parenting books late at night, seeking advice wherever he could find it. He reached out to an old friend, a father of 3, and listened as he recounted his own struggles and triumphs. Bit by bit, Tristan began to believe he could do this. He could be the father Lila needed. One afternoon, while Lila napped in her crib, Tristan stood in the living room, staring at a stack of files on the table.
Work.
It had been weeks since he'd stepped into his office, delegating everything to his team while focusing on Lila. The thought of returning to that world felt distant, almost foreign. For years, his work had defined him, filling the empty spaces inside him with purpose and accomplishment. But now, as he looked at the files, he realized something had shifted. Lila had filled those spaces in a way no achievement ever could. He turned away from the files and walked back to the nursery, sitting beside her crib. He watched her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She was his world now, his reason for trying, his reason for believing he could be better. And for the first time, the weight of responsibility didn't feel so heavy. It felt like love. The days began to take on a rhythm, imperfect but comforting. As Tristan settled into his new role as a father, there were moments of chaos. Nights when Lila refused to sleep, mornings when he couldn't get her to stop crying. But there were also moments of quiet triumph. He was learning, slowly but surely, how to care for her. He had started to recognize the little cues that signaled her needs, the hungry cry, the sleepy whimper, the way her tiny fists curled when she was frustrated. With every successful feeding, every calm moment after a fit of tears, he felt a small, else spark of pride. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One morning, as the soft light of dawn filtered through the nursery window, Tristan sat with Lila in his lap. She stared up at him with her wide, curious eyes. Her tiny mouth formed an almost smile. Suddenly, she let out a soft gurgle. Her face lit up with something that could only be described as joy. It was her first real smile, and Tristan's breath caught. He froze, unsure if he'd imagined it. But then she did it again, her lips curling in a way that made his chest ache. "You're smiling," he whispered, a grin spreading across his face. "You're actually smiling." He felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, a mixture of joy and disbelief. She was still so small, so new to the world, yet in that tiny smile, Tristan saw the beginning of a bond he hadn't been sure he could form. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, his heart swelling in a way he hadn't thought possible. Moments like these made the sleepless nights and constant self-doubt worth it. They gave him the strength to keep going, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But as he grew closer to Lila, Tristan couldn't ignore the growing divide between his new life and the one he had built before her. His company had been his entire world for years, relentless pursuit of success that left little room for anything else. But now, as he watched Lila's tiny milestones, her first laugh, her fascination with the colorful mobile above her crib, he found himself questioning everything. What was the point of all his accomplishments if he couldn't be present for these moments? If he missed the chance to watch his daughter grow? It wasn't an easy decision, but Tristan began to step back from his role as CEO. He delegated responsibilities to his most trusted colleagues, ensuring the company would continue to thrive in his absence. There were objections, of course. investors who questioned his priorities, board members who doubted his commitment. But Tristan stood firm. For the first time in his life, work came second. Instead of 12-hour days in the office, he spent his mornings with Lila, reading to her, feeding her, simply being with her. In the afternoons, he worked from home, carving out hours for calls and meetings while still keeping her close. It was a delicate balance, and there were times when it felt like he was failing at both. But he knew he was doing the right thing. Yet, even as he poured himself into fatherhood, a part of him remained unresolved, a part that couldn't stop thinking about Susan. Her absence loomed over everything, a quiet reminder of the life they could have shared, the family they could have been. One crisp autumn afternoon, Tristan decided it was time to face that lingering grief. He dressed Lila warmly and drove to the cemetery where Susan was buried. The air was cool and still, the trees above casting long shadows across the ground. He carried Lila in his arms as he approached the simple gravestone, its inscription a bittersweet reminder of the woman he had lost. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, unsure of what to say. The last time he had seen Susan, they had parted on good terms, but there had been no indication of what lay ahead, no way of knowing their paths would intersect again in this way. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. If I had known, I would have been there." His throat tightened, and he looked down at Lila, who was gazing up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "She's beautiful, Susan," he said, his voice breaking. "She's perfect. You were right about her and about me." He sank down onto the grass, holding Lila close as he spoke. He told Susan about the sleepless nights, the tiny triumphs, the way Lila's smile had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He apologized for the years they had lost, for not being the man she had believed he could be sooner. "I promise I'll do right by her," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I'll give her the life you wanted for her. I'll make sure she knows how much you loved her." The wind rustled gently through the trees, and for a moment, Tristan felt a sense of peace. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices that had led them here. But he could honor Susan's memory by being the father Lila deserved. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light across the cemetery, Tristan stood and kissed his fingertips before pressing them to Susan's gravestone. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." He turned and walked back to the car, Lila nestled against his chest. She had fallen asleep, her tiny hand clutching the fabric of his jacket. Tristan looked down at her and smiled. The weight of grief still present but no longer overwhelming, he drove home with quiet determination. This was his life now, messy, imperfect, but full of purpose. Lila had given him something he hadn't even realized he was missing, a reason to believe in himself, a reason to keep going. As they reached the apartment and Tristan carried her inside, he glanced around the space that had once felt so empty. It wasn't just his home anymore. It was Lila's too. And together, they were building something new, something that mattered. For the first time in a long time, Tristan felt whole. Tristan had become accustomed to the weight of responsibility, the sleepless nights, and the quiet moments when Lila's curious eyes would meet his. Despite being present for her feedings and comforting her through the darkest hours, a part of him still questioned his adequacy. One evening, after finally getting Lila to sleep, he sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by doubt. Was he doing enough? Was he good enough? He remembered Susan's letter, her unwavering belief in his capacity to love and care for their daughter. She had seen something in him that he struggled to recognize. But what if she had been wrong? What if he failed Lila in the way his father had failed him? The soft sound of Lila's cooing brought him back to the moment. She was in her crib, stirring but not yet awake, her peaceful face a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He thought of his father, the long silences, and the burden of unmet expectations that had shaped his childhood. He whispered, "I won't do that to you. I don't know how, but I will figure it out. You deserve better." He gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, feeling the weight of his promise. As the days passed, Tristan navigated the challenges of fatherhood. Each milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But there were setbacks too, nights of endless crying and days when his insecurities resurfaced.
Still, he pressed on.
He reached out to friends, read parenting books, and began to believe that he could be the father Lila needed. Then one afternoon, as Lila napped peacefully, Tristan found himself facing a different kind of dilemma. His work, which had once defined him, now seemed distant. He looked at the stack of files on the table, realizing that Lila had filled a space in his heart that no achievement ever could. He turned away from the work and walked back to the nursery, where he sat beside her crib, watching her sleep. For the first time, the weight of responsibility didn't feel so heavy. It felt like love. As the weeks went by, Tristan began to settle into his new rhythm as a father. There were chaotic moments, Lila's cries, sleepless nights, but there were also moments of quiet triumph as he began to understand her needs. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One morning, as Lila looked up at him, she gave him her first real smile. The joy he felt was overwhelming, a moment he would treasure forever. But even as Tristan grew closer to Lila, the ghost of Susan's absence lingered. The family they could have been, the life they could have shared, it haunted him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Tristan decided to confront the grief he had been avoiding. He dressed Lila warmly and took her to Susan's grave. As he stood there, holding Lila in his arms, he spoke softly to Susan, apologizing for the years they had lost and promising to be the father Lila deserved. "I'll make sure she knows how much you loved her," he said, his voice breaking. The peace he felt as he left the cemetery was bittersweet, but it strengthened his resolve to honor Susan's memory by being the father Lila needed. However, as he settled into his new life, his privacy was breached. The press, always a part of his life, turned invasive. An article appeared about Lila, the mother of his child. His world was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. The public scrutiny intensified, with paparazzi camped outside his apartment. Tristan's instinct was to protect Lila at all costs. He secured stronger privacy measures and released a statement clarifying his commitment to her, despite the backlash. But as the media frenzy escalated, he realized that he could no longer do this alone. He reached out to friends, including Marcus, a father of 3, and his sister Clara, who had always been the more nurturing one. Clara's visit brought warmth back into the apartment, and her words of encouragement, "You're doing a good job," reassured Tristan in ways he hadn't expected. Even as he leaned on his support system, Tristan couldn't ignore the internal work still left to do. He had spent years building walls, but Lila had begun to break through them. After much thought, he sought therapy, confronting the emotional baggage he had carried for years. It wasn't easy, but with each session, he found the strength to confront his past and the fear of repeating it with Lila. The weeks passed, and Tristan noticed subtle changes within himself. He was more present, less fearful, and more confident in his role as a father. When he looked at Lila, sleeping peacefully in his arms, he saw a version of himself that he was beginning to trust. One evening, as they played on the living room floor, Tristan felt the transformation that had taken place, not just in his home, but in his heart. Lila's laughter filled every corner of the once cold apartment, now alive with warmth and joy. His home, once a symbol of isolation and success, was now a place of love and purpose. It was no longer just his home. It was Lila's too. Together, they were building something new, something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, Tristan felt whole. The apartment, once a sterile space, had transformed into a cozy home, filled with plush animals, books, and a crib adorned with a handmade mobile. Tristan had spent hours assembling it himself, determined to make it perfect. The rest of the house followed suit. Framed photos of Lila adorned the walls, capturing her first smile, her first attempts at crawling, and moments of quiet connection between them. Toys and baby gear were scattered across the living room, and a soft rug replaced the cold marble floor, giving Lila a safe place to play. It was messy, chaotic, and utterly unlike the life Tristan had once lived, but he wouldn't have it any other way. As Lila crawled toward him, babbling in her own language, Tristan scooped her up and planted a kiss on her chubby cheek. She squealed in delight, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. These moments were everything. They made the sleepless nights, the constant juggling of work and parenting, and the lingering challenges worth it. A few months later, Tristan decided to mark a milestone of his own. For years, he had avoided celebrating his birthday, dismissing it as just another day. But now, with Lila in his life, he felt differently. She had given him a reason to celebrate, a reminder that life was worth cherishing. He planned a small gathering, inviting Clara, Marcus, and a handful of close friends who had become a part of Lila's world. The night of the party, the penthouse was filled with the hum of conversation and the sound of laughter. Tristan had transformed the dining area into a cozy, inviting space with fairy lights strung across the windows and a table set with simple, thoughtful touches. Lila, dressed in an adorable floral dress that Clara had picked out, was the center of attention. She toddled between guests, her steps wobbly but determined, charming everyone with her curious gaze and toothy smiles. Tristan watched her with a sense of pride and wonder, still amazed by how much she had changed his life. As the evening wore on, Clara raised a toast to Tristan. For finding joy in the unexpected, for embracing fatherhood with a full heart, and for showing us all that second chances can lead to the most beautiful things. Tristan felt his chest tighten, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He glanced at Lila, who was busy trying to grab a handful of cake from his plate, and smiled. "To Lila," he said, raising his glass, "for teaching me what it means to truly live." The room erupted in cheers, and for the first time in years, Tristan felt a sense of belonging. This wasn't just his home anymore. It was a place filled with love, laughter, and the people who mattered most. In the weeks that followed, Tristan found himself thinking about Susan more often. Her absence was still a quiet ache, but it no longer felt like an open wound. Instead, it was a gentle reminder of the life they could have shared and the promise he had made to honor her memory. Inspired by her letter and the love she had for Lila, Tristan began to envision a way to give back. He remembered how strong and independent Susan had been, how she had faced pregnancy and motherhood alone, and how many others might be in similar situations without the support they needed. That thought grew into an idea, and the idea became a plan. Tristan decided to create a foundation in Susan's name, one dedicated to supporting single parents and children in need. The foundation would provide financial assistance, childcare resources, and access to education and job training, everything Susan might have wanted for herself and Lila. Launching the foundation was a labor of love. Tristan poured himself into the work, meeting with experts, assembling a team, and personally funding the initial programs. For the first time, his wealth felt like more than just a number. It was a tool to create real, meaningful change. At the official launch event, Tristan stood on stage with Lila in his arms. The audience was a mix of colleagues, partners, and beneficiaries of the foundation, their faces filled with anticipation and gratitude. Tristan took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and began to speak. "This foundation is more than just a name," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's a promise to honor someone who believed in love and resilience, even in the face of challenges. Susan Walter was the kind of person who inspired hope, and it's my privilege to carry that hope forward through this work." He glanced down at Lila, who was playing with the microphone cord, oblivious to the significance of the moment. "And it's for her," he continued, his voice softening. "For my daughter Lila, who has shown me the importance of family, connection, and creating a world where every child has the chance to thrive." The room erupted in applause, and Tristan felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. This wasn't just a tribute to Susan or a gift for Lila. It was a new chapter in his life, one that reflected the man he was becoming. As the event wound down and Tristan mingled with the attendees, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. He wasn't just building a better life for Lila. He was building a legacy, one rooted in love, compassion, and second chances. That night, as he tucked Lila into bed, Tristan sat beside her crib and whispered a quiet promise. "We're building something beautiful, Lila. For you, for your mom, and for everyone who needs a chance." The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Tristan's voice as he whispered his promise to Lila. "Thank you for showing me the way," he murmured, his heart full. Lila stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching out as if to grasp the words. Tristan leaned down and kissed her forehead. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Outside, snow gently fell, blanketing the city in a pristine glow. Inside his transformed penthouse, Tristan stood, a steaming mug of cocoa in hand, watching Lila play on the plush rug. She was stacking blocks, focused in the way only a toddler could be. Her little voice filled the room with innocence and wonder. It was New Year's Eve, exactly 1 year since his life had been irrevocably changed by a phone call that shattered his carefully constructed world. He let out a soft breath, watching the condensation form on the window as he gazed at the city lights below. A year ago, this view had felt cold and isolating, the height of his success doing little to fill the void in his heart. Now, the same view felt alive, a backdrop to the warmth and joy Lila had brought into his life. Tristan set his mug down and joined her on the floor. He sat cross-legged as she turned to him, grinning widely. Her tiny hand reached out, offering him a block. "Duh," she said triumphantly. The word, simple as it was, filled Tristan's heart with emotion. It was the first time she had called him duh. He barely held back tears. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said softly, taking the block and adding it to her growing tower. She giggled, knocking it over in delight, and the sound filled him with happiness he hadn't known he could feel. As the clock inched closer to midnight, Clara arrived with sparkling cider and homemade cookies. She greeted Lila with her usual exuberance, scooping her up and twirling her around. Marcus soon followed, his 2 kids in tow, and the penthouse came alive with laughter, chatter, and happy chaos. Tristan watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just a home anymore, it was a haven, a place where love and connection thrived. As the countdown began, everyone gathered in the living room. Clara handed Lila back to Tristan, and he held her close, her small body warm against his chest. She was getting bigger now, her chubby legs strong and determined as she practiced walking with increasing confidence. The group chanted, 5, 4, 3. Then, at the very moment the clock struck 1, Lila squirmed in his arms. Her eyes were bright with determination. She wiggled free and took a wobbly step forward, then another. Tristan froze, his breath caught in his throat. She was walking. Clara clapped her hands in delight. Tristan's heart swelled with pride as he crouched down, arms outstretched. Lila toddled toward him, her movements uncertain, but filled with courage. When she finally fell into his arms, he held her tight, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it," he whispered. "You're amazing, Lila." Outside, fireworks erupted in a kaleidoscope of color, their vibrant explosions lighting up the night sky. Tristan turned toward the window, still holding Lila. Together, they watched the dazzling display. Lila clapped her hands in wonder, her face alight with pure joy. In that moment, Tristan felt a quiet stillness settle over him. The past year had been filled with challenges, growth, and moments that tested him in ways he hadn't imagined. Yet, standing there with Lila in his arms, he realized that every struggle, every doubt, and every tear had been worth it. "You changed everything, you know that," he murmured to her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "A year ago, I didn't even know what I was missing. And now, I can't imagine life without you." She turned to him with a gummy smile, as if she understood every word. Tristan chuckled, his heart so full it felt like it might overflow. Clara came up beside him, her eyes soft as she looked at the two of them. "You're a great dad, Tristan," she said quietly. "Susan would be so proud." Tristan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He thought about Susan often, especially in moments like this, when her absence was felt so strongly in Lila's smile or the shape of her tiny hands. But instead of sadness, there was now a deep sense of gratitude. A gratitude for the love Susan had given him and for the gift of Lila. As the fireworks continued to light up the sky, Tristan held Lila close and whispered promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "I'll always protect you," he said softly. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." The noise of the party swirled around them, but for Tristan, time seemed to slow. He gazed out at the city, the reflections of the fireworks shimmering in the glass, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was his life now, messy, unpredictable, and filled with more love than he had ever thought possible. Lila had shown him the beauty of second chances, the power of connection, and the importance of finding joy in the unexpected. As the final fireworks burst in a dazzling display of light, Tristan looked at Lila, her tiny face filled with wonder. He smiled, knowing he had found his purpose. Life's greatest treasures, he realized, often come from the most unexpected places. In the span of a single year, Tristan went from a man consumed by ambition and loneliness to a father transformed by love, purpose, and hope. Through the challenges and triumphs, he discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or success. It's found in the bonds we share, the lives we touch, and the moments we cherish. So, what about you? Have you ever faced an unexpected moment that completely changed your perspective on life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and here's to finding joy in the unexpected. See you in the next video.